I'm Mangino. Welcome to the Mangino Talks podcast. We talk about everything that matters to Pittsburgh, from current events to Pittsburgh history, social issues to sports, politics to practical day-to-day life. And today, it's marijuana in Pennsylvania. There is now a total of 23 different states that have decided to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes. And what we're going to talk about in this episode is where things stand right now in the state, in the Commonwealth, the likelihood of laws changing, and then a comprehensive look at the arguments for and against. And I cannot think of anyone better to talk about this than Patrick Nightingale. He is the executive director of the Pittsburgh chapter of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. He's also a defense attorney at PKN Law, and he joins us now on Mangino Talks. Patrick, welcome. Great to have you on.
It's always an honor to talk about this subject with you. I know we've been talking about it for a number of years, and we're getting closer. I swear to God, we're getting closer.
Why are you convinced that we're getting closer?
Well, there's a lot of talk in Harrisburg about adult use legalization. We have a governor who fully supports it, and in fact has put revenue from adult use sales in the Pennsylvania budget, I think starting in year 2026 or 2027, where the governor estimated retail or revenue from retail sales at approximately $200 million. This has been something that has had bipartisan support, though tepid support from Pennsylvania's Republican Party. But Senator Dan Laughlin, a Republican from Erie, and Senator Sharif Street, a Democrat from Philadelphia who has been a longtime supporter of cannabis reform in the Commonwealth, announced that they are working on a comprehensive adult use bill to be introduced soon that would cover retail distribution, licensing, social justice, social equity, small business opportunities, and hopefully a number of other issues such as employment issues, housing discrimination issues, et cetera, that we have seen kind of fall through the gaps with the medical marijuana law. On top of that, there is a bill in the Pennsylvania House right now, which we call the state store model, that would essentially convert Pennsylvania's state stores into retail cannabis distribution outlets to be overseen by the Liquor Control Board. This bill has been introduced in the past. It hasn't gotten a lot of support, but it has been introduced, and it's I think it's sitting in the Law and Justice Committee in the House right now. And finally, Dan Frankel, a representative from here in Squirrel Hill, where we live, is supposed to take up the mantle from former Representative Jake Wheatley, who had introduced a comprehensive adult use bill in the House in the last legislative session. So we are, fairly optimistic that we will have bills. And the important thing to consider here is, even though it's a very narrow majority, Democrats have a majority in the Pennsylvania House. That means that they cannot be stymied from moving a bill through committee, since they now have the committee assignments and a Democrat controls that committee. And forgive me, I don't know which representative is the current chair of the Law and Justice Committee. But in the past, we have never been able to get a bill moving through committee because the Republicans held the majority in the House and the Senate, and would not allow any type of committee hearing on an adult use bill. But I think that the times they are changing, and if the House takes the lead on this, get it through committee, get it to the floor for a vote, send it over to the Senate for concurrence, and we may be able to finally present a bill to Governor Shapiro to sign within this legislative session.
It's my understanding that there are some leaders in the Senate, Republicans, that are in favor of this. Now, maybe not the committee chairs, but my understanding is that leadership at the top is open to the idea of having serious dialogue and debate and discussion about legalizing marijuana. Am I correct on that?
I believe so, because when I had a chance to talk to Senator Street about this a couple of months ago, he said, listen, we're working behind the scenes with our Republican colleagues. We believe that there is support. I know that last year, Senator Mike Regan, a Republican from either Carlisle or Cumberland County, and a former U.S. Marshal, took the lead on this and had the first ever adult use hearings in the Pennsylvania Senate, though it was not in the Judiciary Committee. It was just he called, hearings on his own. But, that tells me that we're starting to get serious and moving past, reefer madness nonsense and moving past, stereotypical stereotypes about why this is a bad idea, and having a serious conversation about, number one, bringing adult use to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and two, utilizing best practices, learning the lessons that other states have had to learn the hard way about what works and what doesn't work. And if we can continue with that approach, as opposed to, for example, reinventing the wheel here in Pennsylvania and pretending that no one has ever done this before, then I think that the chances of having a good, comprehensive adult use bill that takes into consideration all of the concerns of the stakeholders, from the cannabis consumers themselves, from the municipalities that would be affected by this, from Pennsylvania's farmers and minority business owners that are looking forward for a chance to get in, having been shut out of the medical marijuana program, and for the operators who are currently operating grow processing facilities and retail dispensaries here in the Commonwealth.
The more comprehensive you try to get with the bill, that not only covers those issues, but also social justice, social equity, and I mean from the then you have the criminal justice aspect of wanting to expunge records. The more complex it gets, the more comprehensive, the more difficult it is to get legislation to pass. Can you see this being a hindrance? Are we better off going with a more targeted approach of just making it legal with some basic ways of making it function, and then go after all of the other things later? Or do you think it's an all or nothing approach that needs to be taken here?
I think, practically speaking, it has to be the all or nothing approach as opposed to incremental piecemeal legislation. And I say that because of my experience with passing medical marijuana, where lawmakers would say to me, listen, we're close. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Pass it now, fix it later. This might not be a perfect bill, but as long as we get it across the goal line, we can always come back and address some of the issues that we have with it. And that has proven to be illusory. We have had no ability to get back and to try to address some of the glaring holes within our medical marijuana bill, because there's just no appetite in Harrisburg to, quote, reopen the act. So I think that our legislative leaders understand that we're going to have one shot at passing something in Pennsylvania. So it better be as good as it can possibly be, taking into consideration the various stakeholders and what their interests are. For example, I think that social equity is something that is very important to a number of our Democratic supporters. They understand that our communities, especially communities of color here in Pennsylvania, have been disproportionately impacted by the war on cannabis. And they don't want to see, these communities completely shut out as they have been in our medical program, because the medical program was, very limited in scope and very expensive to try to obtain a license. But if we're talking about full adult use and benefiting all Pennsylvanians, then you want to make sure that people who might not otherwise be able to put together $500,000 in equity to make a play for a license have an opportunity to take advantage of the business opportunities. Same with Pennsylvania's farmers. I mean, we have a robust agricultural community in Pennsylvania. It's one of our prime economic generators. These individuals should have an opportunity to also get into the market and compete, and not simply limited to a small number of large corporate entities that operate in multiple states. There's room for everybody, but I think that if you take a piecemeal approach, you're simply not going to get back in, address the issues that get left out. Social justice, expungements, retroactive expungements, critically important, in my opinion. And if you leave that out, then, in 2 or 3 years, is there going to be any appetite to come back and try to tackle it? Or is the attitude going to be like, well, it's legal now, just go through the regular pardon process. Yes, it may take months, a year, 2 years to get through it, but hey, it's legal, don't worry about it. I think that is an incorrect approach. Or look at DUI issues. That to me is the biggest issue facing Pennsylvania's medical cannabis community, because every patient in Pennsylvania under our zero tolerance law is DUI 24/7, 365. And it has been that way since the very first sale of legal medical cannabis in February of 2018. We've got over 425,000 people, patients in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and if they're operating a motor vehicle, they're automatically guilty of driving under the influence, even if there is zero evidence of actual impairment. These are some of the myriad of issues that have come up that we simply can't get a fix, because it is very hard to get legislation moving through Harrisburg. So throw it all on the table and let's see how it shakes out, but don't, in my opinion, take a piecemeal approach.
Let's go back to what you were saying with the governor and what he's proposing for revenues coming up in year 26, 27. That's still 3 years away, right? So the question then is, does it take that long to put in all of the regulations in place that once you pass legalization for recreational use, could it be another 2, 3, 4 years maybe before everything is put in place to make it be a functioning piece of legislation in Pennsylvania?
Well, I think that we can take guidance from the medical marijuana law. The medical marijuana law was passed in April of 2016. And once it passed, there had to be regulations promulgated to cover things such as license applications for dispensaries, license applications for cultivation and processing facilities. Mm-hmm. We had to set up, other regulatory processes that would allow Act 16 to be to take place. The patient registry, setting up the physician registry, the training program for physicians, and it took 2 years, a little less than 2 years, from the date that the bill was signed to the first products being available in Pennsylvania dispensaries. And those early days were also beset with a number of problems. For at least 6 months, there was a chronic and critical shortage of supply relative to demand. And it took, a good, I think, 3 years for Pennsylvania's medical marijuana program to start to fully mature. Now we're talking about a statewide adult use program that's going to involve a much larger number, I hope, of potential license holders, everywhere from the big players, Cresco, Trulieve, or whomever. Also, hopefully, small business entities, Pennsylvania farmers, urban cultivation or distribution businesses. So I think it's very realistic that even if the bill passed today mm-hmm. and Governor Shapiro signed it, we're talking a good couple of years before the program is fully operational, because you've got to get these facilities licensed. You've got to allow people time to get their investors together and to put their figure out, hey, we're going for this, we're going for that, and then to actually grow the plants, process them into products, and get them onto the shelves in a safe and responsible manner.
When you look at this legislation and the possibilities of it and the arguments that are made for and against, as a defense attorney, you understand very well the arguments from the prosecution. So I'm guessing that you also have to study diligently the arguments from those that are opposed to legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes and the ability to overcome those objections. What do you see as the biggest barriers that you have to overcome, either in a legislative conversation with lawmakers or in a public conversation, to whenever those that are still either on the fence or adamantly opposing the idea of recreational use of marijuana?
Yeah, I think that people are finally starting to move away from the gateway drug theory that if you consume marijuana, you're more likely to go on to be a hard drug abuser. But that's nonetheless something that constantly gets thrown out there by people who oppose legalization, and there's never any pushback. There's never any, okay, if you think that legal marijuana leads to higher rates of opioid use, of opioid-related overdoses, and hard drug use, do you have any actual data to support that? Oh, excuse me. Minnesota just became the 23rd state to legalize. Now their program is in its infancy, and it's going to be a while before Minnesota has full retail distribution. But we've got a number of other states to look at. Is California's rates of opioid use and overdoses higher than Texas's, for example, or Colorado's, for example, or Utah's, or Kentucky's? Show me evidence where you can say in these states that have adult use programs, there is a 2%, 3%, 5%, 10% higher rate of opioid use and opioid overdoses. Then maybe we can have a conversation about whether or not there's the possibility that marijuana acts as this, quote, gateway drug. But we never get past that initial, well, we're in the midst of an opioid crisis. Why would we legalize a dangerous controlled substance and cause more people to, die from fentanyl? And there's never any pushback on it. I mean, even the DEA has moved away from the gateway drug theory. It's nonsense, but it is so easy for prohibitionists to throw that out there, and they never have any pushback.
Okay.
So that's one thing that I want to be prepared to talk about, is that you cannot show me any actual link between cannabis use and hard drug use, and we can look at other adult use states to confirm that. That's number one. Number two, and this is something that is concerning me more and more, number two is youth access to cannabis and cannabis products. We have long argued that in a regulated system of distribution where you have to be 21 or over to get inside the facility, that helps to reduce youth access to cannabis products, similar to the liquor store. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, Pat, are you telling me that kids can't get a hold of a case of beer or a bottle of wine or something like that? Well, of course they can. But someone who is 21 years or older has to make that initial purchase. Whereas right now, if you're in high school and even in middle school, there can be another kid that is selling, marijuana products in an unregulated fashion that makes it easier for those products to get into the hands of our youth. Now, what has given me a lot of concern is the current state of Delta 8 products that kind of exist quasi-legally as products that are extracted from legal hemp. As I think you know, we've got a farm bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, that legalized the cultivation, production, distribution, processing, and interstate commerce of marijuana plants, cannabis plants, with 0.3% total THC or less.
Yes.
So these are plants that cannot possibly get you high. The THC percentage is so low, it has no psychoactive effect. However, what has been going on for the past couple of years is that cannabis entrepreneurs have figured out how to extract Delta 8, which is a psychoactive cannabinoid. It's not as strong as Delta 9. Think of it as the light beer or marijuana light, but Delta 8 is nonetheless psychoactive. And Delta 8 can be synthetically extracted from CBD, which itself is extracted from the hemp plants. So now we've got a very large unregulated business in Pennsylvania and across the United States, where Delta 8 products are showing up literally in convenience stores and in gas stations. And these are products that are psychoactive. And I've had a number of prosecutors tell me, what can we do about this? They're showing up in our middle schools. It's like, we understand this isn't, regulated marijuana. We understand that this is, unregulated, and it's coming out, legally under the Farm Bill. But that's something where I think that I'm concerned that people are going to say, wait a minute, you want to legalize Delta 9 when its less powerful cousin Delta 8 is in our schools, and kids are, are going to hospital and they're having emergency room issues. To me, the answer to that is regulate Delta 8 in the same way you regulate Delta 9. But for right now, it's a real concern.
Right. I get that. One of the things that I hear a lot about is the issue of DUI. You talked about it earlier, that if you have a medical marijuana card, then you are presumed DUI. The companion issue to that is, how do you then handle those that would go to work, and are they then viewed as under the influence? Are you confident? Can you persuade people that there is a way of testing individuals to ensure that they are not under the influence, whether it be behind the wheel of a car or at work?
Well, I think those are two separate issues that need to be discussed separately.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is when it comes to DUI, we have law enforcement officers who are trained to detect DUI. They're trained to detect alcohol impairment. They're trained to detect impaired drivers, whether a driver, let's say, is extremely sleepy, or that driver has used their prescription medication, or that driver has smoked methamphetamine or crack cocaine or utilized opiates, or used cannabis products. And I think that our police officers, generally speaking, as law enforcement professionals, are very well equipped during a traffic stop to at least make that initial assessment. Hey, I believe that this person may be impaired. And why might that officer believe that? Look at all the circumstances surrounding a potential DUI traffic stop. Let's say I'm going 25 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone. If I'm that officer pulling, making that traffic stop, I'm immediately thinking to myself, this is unusual. Most people are not driving 20 miles an hour below the speed limit. Or if you see a vehicle that's weaving in and out of its lane, or a vehicle that stops at a stop sign and then sits there for 10 or 15 seconds.
Right.
Or conversely, someone driving at an excessive speed or driving excessively recklessly. That officer, when they make that traffic stop, is going to say to themselves, this is not typical behavior of a motorist. Is this a signal that there may be some impairment issues? Then the next step is the initial interaction with the motorist. What type of physical attributes is the motorist exhibiting? Does the motorist have glassy or bloodshot eyes? Is their speech slurred? Are there reaction time delayed? Is there something that would suggest that this motorist, may be impaired either, because of a physical condition or because of a drug impairment, something like that?
Right.
Then the next step, sir, have you had anything to drink, or have you had any, drugs or narcotics recently? What always surprises me is how many times my clients will simply try to talk their way out of it. Oh, Mr. Officer, yeah, I had 2 beers at the bar earlier, but that's it. Then they come back with a 0.25 BAC. Or, well, I smoked some marijuana, but it was yesterday. However, there's a strong odor of burned marijuana emanating from the interior of the motor vehicle, and the officer sees a half-smoked, blunt or joint in the ashtray. Those are some pretty good indicators that there may be impairment that we're dealing with. Next, standard field sobriety tests, physical observations, horizontal gaze nystagmus, and then finally, a chemical test, all of which can help determine whether or not the individual was actually impaired or not. So I think that, right now, in the absence of some type of portable breath test that would detect, the presence of some type of THC or THC metabolites, I think that law enforcement are very well equipped to deal with drug impaired drivers, whether it's cannabis or any other drugs. And they do that in the majority of the states in the United States of America. Pennsylvania is one of 13 states with zero tolerance. Even total prohibition states like Texas require proof of actual impairment. It's not that great of a hurdle. And I think the most important thing to argue here is that we are not asking for a blank slate. We all agree that impaired driving is dangerous and that impaired drivers must be prosecuted as permitted under the law. What we don't agree with is non-impaired drivers being prosecuted as if they were as if they had a BAC of 0.16 or above. So, I think that when we talk about this, we say, number one, under no circumstances should any motorist be driving impaired, whether it's cannabis, prescription narcotics, alcohol, or even if you've gone 48 hours without sleep, you're going to be an impaired driver.
That makes sense.
Stay off the damn road. And number two, law enforcement knows what to look for. They know how to investigate DUIs, and they know how to bring a case to the district attorney. Now, sometimes law enforcement gets it wrong. I have a case right now where my client took a seizure and had an accident. And law enforcement were convinced that he was impaired by drugs. They went through his wallet. They found his medical marijuana card. They put him through the whole drug recognition expert protocol, taking his pulse, getting admissions, so on and so forth. And they concluded that my client was clearly impaired by marijuana. His blood test came back with 0 delta-9 THC and 7.9 carboxy THC. That's the non-psychoactive metabolite that can be detected for days, weeks, or months after use. Mm-hmm. What that to me conclusively proves is that this man had not used cannabis, had not used medical cannabis for a number of days, if not weeks. He had 0 delta-9 THC. There was no impairing substance in his blood whatsoever.
Right.
There was only evidence of a non-psychoactive metabolite. That says that, yes, law enforcement is trained to do this. However, sometimes the chemical test results will come back and say, well, you know, your drug recognition expert actually made a mistake in this case because the client had a seizure and was not impaired by marijuana. And as long as, you know, I have the ability to bring that to court and say, look at these blood test results, Your Honor, he could not possibly have been impaired. Yes. That's what all we're asking for is the ability to defend it the same way that you would defend a prescription narcotic DUI.
Would you address the issue of the workplace then?
Yes, the workplace, right now under Pennsylvania's medical marijuana law, for example, it says that an employer may not discriminate against a patient solely for being a patient, but that an employer is not required to accommodate medical marijuana use at the workplace. Additionally, if an employee's performance of their job suffers because of their use of medical cannabis, then an employer does have the ability to discipline that employee. The challenge here is, how is an employer making a determination whether or not an employee is, quote, impaired? Because most often what is utilized in the workplace is a urine screen. Okay, you know, we think you may be impaired. We're going to have you, you know, subjected to a urine screen. But all a urine screen can detect is carboxy THC, the non-psychoactive metabolite. It cannot detect whether or not there's active delta-9 THC in the employee's blood at the time that they're working, which could potentially be indicative of impairment. I think that in an adult use scenario, non-medical, pure adult use, an employer has every right to say to their employees, you don't get to drink at work, you don't get to smoke weed at work, you don't get to use methamphetamine at work. So, you know, unless you've got a prescription for, you know, either medical marijuana or OxyContin or benzodiazepines, you are not permitted to come to my workplace, you know, in any type of impaired fashion.
Do you foresee a test coming down the road that will be as cost effective and as easy to perform that's similar to a urine test, so that a suspecting employer can then run this test on an employee? I mean, granted, now, if you see somebody coming in and they look like they're on alcohol or they look like they're on some other illegal drug, you can address the issue. Is there going to be a test down the road? And are you suggesting then that employers would use the same standards for visually observing individuals under the impairment of alcohol that's legal and do that same thing with marijuana that would then be legal?
Yeah, as far as a more efficient test than urine screens right now, I don't see anything in the short term. Okay. There has been a lot of talk about these portable breath tests or a portable saliva test to, you know, detect the presence of THC or THC metabolites, but that's not going to correspond to actual impairment. So the challenge that we have is, how can that employer, for example, you know, determine actual impairment? Right. Now, in the case of alcohol, if someone comes in reeking of booze, that's one thing. Yes. But what if someone is drunk and they're not reeking of booze? You know, you're putting the employer in the position of making a subjective judgment about whether or not the employee is actually impaired. And I think that you then have to start to look to other aspects. Is this employee failing to do their job adequately or in a satisfactory function. Has this employee been talked to about it and told, here's where you're starting to slip up. We need to see you take care of these issues, or we may have to send you to HR.
Right.
If that employee, because of their cannabis use at the job place, continues to fail to adequately perform their duties, then that employer is going to have a very strong case for discipline or discharge. What I'm concerned about is employers who really have no experience whatsoever in drug impairment detection, making bad faith judgments to punish or discriminate against employees that they don't like. But it is clearly an issue that has got to be discussed within the context of a comprehensive adult use bill, as opposed to leaving it hanging out there and people fumbling along trying to figure out what their rights are, which is kind of what we've seen in the past 5 years of employment discrimination litigation relative to medical marijuana patients.
Patrick Nightingale, Executive Director of the Pittsburgh chapter of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. He's also a defense attorney at PKN Law. And we've been talking about marijuana laws in Pennsylvania, where we stand, the likelihood of laws changing, and a look at the arguments for and against. Patrick, thank you so much for your time today.
Robert, it was a pleasure, and it was really nice to get into the weeds, so to speak, and to really flesh out some of these issues. So thank you very much for bringing me on.
You better believe it. I'm looking forward to having you on again very soon. Thank you very much for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast. New episodes drop Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. For more on me and the show, be sure to visit ManginoTalks.com. Follow me on your favorite social media platform by using @ManginoTalks, or you can just Google Mangino Talks. Once you find me, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the pages with your friends and family. And thanks again for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast.